The fluorescent lights of the long hallway didn't buzz, they just hummed a low, steady note that seemed to vibrate right into a person's bones. It was a colorless kind of light, the kind that makes everyone look a little bit tired and a little bit pale, no matter how healthy they actually are. The air here smelled different than the outside world. It was a sharp mix of strong cleaner and something else, something softer and sadder, like old flowers and coffee that had been sitting on a warmer for too long. This was the quiet wing of the hospital, the place where time moved slower and where people spoke in whispers even when they didn't have to. A young man named Leo walked down this hallway, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. He was 18, though in his faded blue jeans and oversized gray hoodie he looked younger. His face was drawn tight, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed from lack of sleep. But the most striking thing about him wasn't his face, it was what he carried. In one hand he gripped the neck of a large cello case, and in the other he held a bow case. The instrument was heavy, a burden he was used to carrying, but today it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It bumped gently against his leg with every step he took, a rhythmic reminder of why he was here. He wasn't here for a concert. He wasn't here for a rehearsal. He was here for his mother. She had been in this room for 2 weeks. The doctors used big, complicated words to describe what was happening inside her body, words that sounded like a foreign language when they tried to explain it. But Leo didn't need the big words. He knew what it meant. It meant that the woman who had taught him how to tie his shoes, the woman who had driven him to countless music lessons, the woman who could make the best grilled cheese sandwich in the world, was slipping away. She was sleeping most of the time now. Her skin was paper thin, and her breathing had become shallow and uneven. The nurse at the front desk had warned him earlier that morning that she might not wake up today, or maybe even tomorrow. They told him to be prepared. But Leo didn't want to be prepared. He wanted her to wake up. He wanted one more chance to talk to her, one more chance to hear her laugh, even if it was just a quiet, tired laugh. He turned a corner and stopped in front of room 304. The door was already pushed all the way open, leaving the room exposed to the busy hallway. There was no heavy wooden barrier to shut out the world, just a gaping entrance that invited anyone to look in. Leo stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at the figure lying in the bed. It felt strange to hesitate outside his own mother's room, but the fear of seeing her so still was a brick in his throat. He swallowed hard, forcing the feeling down, and stepped inside. The room was small. Besides the bed, there was only a reclining chair covered in a soft blue blanket and a small bedside table stacked with get-well cards and a half-empty water pitcher. The machines beside the bed were the loudest things in the space. They beeped and clicked, tracing jagged green lines on a black screen, measuring a heart rate that was getting weaker every day. It was a mechanical sound, cold and unfeeling, and it made Leo's chest ache. He walked over to the metal chair that sat against the wall. It wasn't a comfortable chair. It had a hard back and a vinyl seat that stuck to your legs if you sat in it for too long. But Leo had spent hours in it over the last few days. He dragged it closer to the bedside, the metal legs scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. The noise seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room, and he winced, looking quickly at his mother. She didn't move. Her chest rose and fell barely an inch, her eyes closed, her hands resting loosely on top of the white sheets. Leo sat down and gently laid the cello case on the floor beside him. He unzipped the heavy canvas cover, the sound of the teeth separating seeming to echo in the small space. He lifted the instrument out, resting the large wooden body between his knees. It felt familiar, an old friend that had never let him down. For years, this cello had been his way of speaking when he didn't have the words. It was how he expressed anger when he failed a test, joy when he made the varsity team, and sadness when his first pet dog passed away. Now he needed it to say goodbye. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small block of rosin. He rubbed the rough cake against the bow hairs, over and over, until the white powder dusted his fingers. It was a ritual, something he did 1,000 times without thinking, but today he did it with slow, deliberate movements. He needed to focus on the small details, the friction of the rosin, the tightness of the strings, the smell of the wood, because if he thought about why he was really doing this, he knew he would fall apart. Outside the room, the hospital kept moving. He could hear the soft rattle of a medication cart passing by, the low murmur of a nurse giving instructions, the distant chime of an elevator. Life was going on for everyone else. People were drinking coffee, typing on computers, worrying about traffic or the weather. But in here, in room 304, the world had shrunk down to the size of a hospital bed and a mother who wouldn't open her eyes. Leo looked up from his instrument and stared at his mother's face. She looked so peaceful, so much younger than she actually was, almost like she was just taking a nap on a Sunday afternoon. He remembered how she used to sit in the living room when he was practicing at home. She would pretend to read a magazine, but he knew she was listening to every note. She was his biggest critic and his biggest fan. If he played a wrong note, she would scrunch up her nose. If he played beautifully, she would just smile and keep reading, but she knew she was proud.
"I learned something new, Mom," Leo whispered. His voice cracked, sounding dry and unused. He cleared his throat softly, trying to push the lump back down. "It's hard. I've been working on it for weeks. I think you'd like it." He paused, waiting for a response. He knew there wouldn't be one, but the silence in the room still felt heavy. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, counting out the seconds he had left with her. He felt a sudden wave of panic, a cold rush that started in his stomach and spread out to his fingertips. What if she couldn't hear him? What if the music didn't matter? What if he played his heart out and the room just stayed the same? He pushed the fear away. He had to try. He couldn't just sit here and hold her hand while she faded away. He had to give her something, a piece of himself, a piece of the life she had given him. Leo adjusted the end pin of the cello, setting it firmly into the floor. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sterile air, and closed his eyes for just a second. He pictured their living room at home, the sunlight coming through the windows, the smell of dinner cooking. He tried to put that image into his fingers. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "Okay." He placed the bow on the strings. He didn't start playing yet. He just let the wood rest there, feeling the tension. He wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if the music would be enough. But he knew he couldn't leave without trying, because a silence is a terrible thing to leave between two people who love each other. He opened his eyes, looked at his mother one last time, and prepared to break the silence. The heavy wooden silence that usually filled the room was suddenly broken by the sound of footsteps clicking against the hard floor. Leo didn't look up right away. He was too focused on the fingerboard of his cello, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the strings. He thought maybe it was just a nurse passing by, checking the monitors or changing a trash bag in the hallway. But the footsteps didn't keep going. They stopped right at the entrance. Standing there was a woman named Diane. She wasn't a nurse, and she wasn't a doctor. She was the hospital's volunteer coordinator, a woman who spent her days organizing schedules, managing the flow of visitors, and making sure that things didn't descend into chaos. She wore a bright pink vest over her clothes and held a clipboard tightly against her chest as if it were a shield. Her hair was perfectly styled, not a hair out of place, and she had the kind of face that tried to smile even when she was delivering bad news. Diane looked from her clipboard to Leo and then to the open doorway. She cleared her throat, a polite but sharp sound that made Leo freeze. He stopped tightening his bow and looked up, his eyes wide. For a second, he looked like a kid caught with his hand in a cookie jar, even though he wasn't doing anything wrong. "Excuse me," Diane said, her voice soft but firm. She took a step into the room, her sensible shoes squeaking on the floor. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have strict rules about noise in this ward." "Noise? I haven't started playing yet. I was just tuning." "I know, and I appreciate that," Diane said, walking a little closer. She glanced at her clipboard, tapping a pen against it nervously. "But this is the quiet zone, the hospice wing. People here are very sensitive to sound. We have families trying to rest, patients trying to sleep. Even the tuning can be disruptive." "My mom," Leo started, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. "She loves music. She's the reason I play. I thought if I played something soft, it might help." Diane's expression softened. She saw the boy's red eyes, the way his shoulders slumped forward. She dealt with grieving families every day, and she knew the look of someone who was holding on by a thread. But she also had a job to do. There was a schedule to keep. There were other families down the hall who had complained about a crying baby earlier, and the head nurse was in a mood. "I understand," she said, her tone becoming gentler, motherly almost. "I really do. But visiting hours for performances ended an hour ago. We had a harpist in the common area earlier, and that was the designated time. We can't have impromptu concerts in the rooms. It sets a precedent. If we let you play, then the guy in 305 wants to play his radio, and the lady in 302 wants to bring in her dog." "It's not a concert," Leo said, a sudden edge of frustration creeping into his voice. He wasn't trying to be rude. He was just desperate. He gripped the neck of the cello tighter. "I can't make exceptions, honey. It's not fair to everyone else. You need to pack up. You can come back and visit tomorrow during normal hours, but the instrument has to stay in the case." She reached out as if to touch his shoulder, to comfort him, but Leo pulled back slightly. He felt a hot flash of anger rise in his chest, followed immediately by a wave of helplessness. This woman was just doing her job. She wasn't a villain. She was trying to keep order in a place where things were falling apart. But she didn't understand. She didn't know that this might be the only chance he had. "I can't come back tomorrow," Leo said, his voice cracking. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "The doctors said she might not make it through the night. There isn't going to be a tomorrow. Not really."
Diane stopped. Her hand froze in midair. The pen stopped tapping against the clipboard. She looked at the woman in the bed, really looked at her for the first time. She saw how pale she was, how the chest barely moved. She saw the tubes and the wires that kept her tethered to the world. She had seen this scene 1,000 times, but somehow, looking at this young man with his cello, it hit her differently. It wasn't just a patient in a bed, it was a mom, and it was a son who was running out of time. The air in the room seemed to get very heavy. The beeping from the machine sounded louder, like a countdown. Diane felt a tightness in her own chest. She thought about her own mother, living across the country, how she hated the thought of not being there if something happened. She thought about the rules she enforced every day, rules about parking, rules about flowers, rules about noise. Most of the time, those rules made sense. They kept things running smoothly. But right now, in this small, sterile room, the rules felt stupid. They felt cold and unfeeling. Leo looked at her, his eyes pleading. He wasn't looking at the volunteer coordinator anymore. He was looking at the one person who had the power to let him do this one last thing. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just asked the question that broke through all the bureaucracy and the schedules. "Please," he whispered. The word hung in the air between them. "Can I play this for my mom? She hasn't opened her eyes in 3 days. I just need her to hear it once. I just need to know she heard it before she goes." Diane stood there, perfectly still. The hallway noise seemed to fade away, leaving just the sound of the boys breathing and the hum of the machines. She looked at the clipboard in her hand, at the neatly printed list of rules and regulations. It felt ridiculous. It felt like the most unimportant thing in the world. She looked at the cello, a beautiful instrument made of wood and varnish, capable of making sounds that could make you cry or make you feel like you were flying. And she looked at the boy, who was willing to break the rules just to say goodbye. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. She lowered the clipboard to her sigh. Her face changed, the professional mask slipping away to reveal the human being underneath. She nodded, just a small, barely there movement. "Just this once," she said softly. "Play it soft." Leo let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a week. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Diane didn't leave. She stepped back a few paces, moving out of the direct line of sight, but staying close to the door. She didn't want to intrude, but she couldn't walk away. Something about the moment kept her feet planted firmly on the floor. She watched as Leo adjusted the cello one last time. He closed his eyes for a second, centering himself. He wasn't worried about the rules anymore. He wasn't worried about the noise complaints. He was just thinking of a song, a melody that he hoped would reach his mother wherever she was. He raised the bow. The silence of the room stretched out, waiting, anticipating. Diane stood by the door, her arms crossed over her clipboard, holding her own breath. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be down the hall making sure the gift shop was closed on time. But she knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The boy was about to play, and for some reason she needed to hear it too. The moment the tip of the bow touched the strings, the entire atmosphere of the hallway seemed to shift. It wasn't a loud sound, nor was it sudden. It was a deep, resonant hum that started low in the belly of the cello and vibrated outward, cutting through the sterile smell of disinfectant and the relentless mechanical beeping of the monitors. It felt like a warm breeze blowing through a cold, drafty house. The sharp fluorescent lights somehow seemed to dim, not actually changing brightness, but losing their harsh glare as the music began to fill the space. Leo didn't look up from his instrument. He was in a world of his own now, his fingers pressing down on the fingerboard with a precision that came from years of practice. His eyes were closed, his face tilted slightly upward, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. The melody wasn't a fast, energetic tune. It was slow, drawn out, and heavy with a kind of sadness that was too beautiful to be depressing. It was the sound of a memory, the sound of looking back at happy times and knowing they were gone. Down the hall, a nurse named David was standing at the medication cart, counting out small white pills into a plastic cup. He was a man who prided himself on being focused, on not letting the emotional weight of the hospital affect his work. He had heard the volunteer coordinator talking to the boy earlier, and he had agreed with her. Rules were important for keeping things calm. But as the first few notes of the cello drifted down the corridor toward him, his hand stopped in midair. He didn't mean to stop. He just couldn't find it himself to keep moving. The sound wrapped around him, distracting him from the numbers and the dosages. It demanded his attention. He looked over his shoulder toward the open doorway of room 304. He couldn't see the boy from where he was standing, but he could see the silhouette of Diane, the volunteer coordinator, standing just outside the threshold. She wasn't moving either. She was just standing there, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side, staring into the room. It was unlike her. Usually she would be hurrying along to the next task, making sure the wheels of the hospital were greased and turning. But now she was a statue, captured by the music. Another nurse, a younger woman named Rachel, came out of a patient's room further down the hall. She was carrying a stack of folded towels, looking tired and ready for her shift to end. She heard the music and slowed her pace. She looked at David, a question on her face, but he just put a finger to his lips. The message was clear. Listen. It wasn't just the staff who were pausing. The hospital was a place of constant movement, a place where people hurried to get to surgeries, to get to bad news, to get to coffee. But as the music grew stronger, swelling into a higher register, that movement began to stall. A janitor pushing a large, loud yellow bin stopped at the intersection of the corridor. He leaned against the handle of the bin, taking off his cap to run a hand through his hair. He wasn't thinking about which floor to mop next. He was thinking about his own daughter who played the violin and how he hadn't called her in weeks.
A man in a gray suit who had been pacing anxiously near the elevators waiting for news about his own wife stopped in his tracks. He stood still in the middle of the hallway, ignoring the "Do Not Block" sign on the floor. The music seemed to speak to him directly. It didn't have words, but it told a story of love and loss that he understood perfectly. He rubbed his chin, his eyes misting over, and turned slowly toward the source of the sound. It started as just a few people stopping what they were doing, but then it became something more. People began to move toward room 304. It wasn't a crowd rushing in. That would have been rude and disruptive. It was a slow, quiet migration. An elderly woman pushing a walker came from the waiting room. A teenage girl with headphones around her neck stepped out of the elevator and stopped, mesmerized. Even a doctor who usually rushed past everyone with his eyes glued to a file folder slowed his pace, lowering his papers to listen. They gathered in a wide arc in the hallway, spilling out from the doorway. No one spoke. There were no whispers, no questions. The only sound was the deep, rich voice of the cello and the soft shuffle of shoes as people found a place to stand. It was a strange mix of people, strangers who would never normally acknowledge each other, all united by the sound coming from one boy and his instrument. Diane watched them gather, feeling a lump form in her throat. She saw the pain on their faces, the way the music was unlocking things they had been keeping bottled up. She realized then that this wasn't just about Leo and his mother anymore. This was about everyone in that hallway. This was about the shared experience of being human, of loving someone and eventually having to let them go. The music made it okay to feel those things, even if just for a few minutes. Leo was unaware of the audience he was drawing. His world had narrowed down to the vibrations in his fingertips and the image of his mother in his mind. He played the chorus of the song, a part that was meant to be uplifting but carried a heavy undertone. He played everything he had into it. He played the frustration of the long nights in the hospital, the fear of the future, and the overwhelming love he had for the woman who had raised him. He played like his heart was breaking, because it was. Inside the room, the machines continued their rhythmic clicking, but they seemed less intrusive now. They were no longer the dominant sound. They had become the background beat to a much more important song. The music filled every corner of the small space, bouncing off the walls and the floor, creating a cocoon of sound around the bed. Standing near the back of the small crowd, a security guard crossed his arms over his chest. He had come up to tell people to clear the hallway because they were blocking traffic, but the moment he heard the music, he forgot his radio. He stood there, a large, imposing figure who looked surprisingly gentle. He watched the boy sitting on the hard metal chair, the concentration etched on his young face. The guard thought about his own mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. He remembered sitting by her bed, holding her hand, feeling helpless. He wished he had had a cello back then. He wished he had had a way to say goodbye that wasn't just words. The hallway was usually a place of transit, a bridge from one place to another, but right now it felt like a destination. It felt like a sanctuary. The air seemed to still, carrying the notes of the cello far down the corridor, reaching even the people who couldn't leave their rooms. A patient in the room next door pressed her nurse call button, not because she needed pain medication, but because she wanted to know what that beautiful sound was. Diane felt a hand on her shoulder. It was David, the nurse with the medication cup. He had finished his rounds and come to stand by her. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed her shoulder gently. They stood side by side, listening to the boy pour his soul out into the open air. The clipboard, the rules, the schedule, they all seemed so small now.
In the face of this raw, honest emotion, the bureaucracy of the hospital didn't stand a chance. The song moved toward a bridge, the tempo slowing even more. The notes became longer, lingering in the air like smoke. The silence between the notes was just as powerful as the sound itself. It gave everyone time to breathe, time to think, time to feel. The crowd in the hallway leaned in collectively, as if afraid they might miss a single vibration. There was something incredibly intimate about watching this private moment, a son saying goodbye to his mother in the only language he had left. And yet, because the door was open, because the music travels, it had become a public moment of mourning for everyone there. It was a communal acknowledgement that life is fragile and love is strong. They were all witnessing a miracle of sorts, not the raising of the dead, but the raising of the human spirit in the face of death. Leo's bow arm moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't rush, he didn't fight the music. He let it flow through him, trusting that it was going where it needed to go. He was playing for her, but in a way, he was also playing for the janitor, for the nurse, for the businessman in the suit, and for the security guard. He was playing for anyone who had ever loved someone and had to let them go. And in that crowded hallway, under the hum of fluorescent lights, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. As the melody moved past the introduction and settled into its core, the sound seemed to change texture. It wasn't just sound waves anymore. It became something physical, something you could almost reach out and touch. The notes were deep and resonant, vibrating against Leo's chest, but they seemed to reach far beyond the small room. The cello has a unique way of sounding like a human voice, and in that moment, it sounded exactly like a heart breaking and healing all at the same time.
Leo's eyes were still closed, blocking out the sterile white walls and the scary medical equipment. In his mind, he wasn't in a hospital anymore. He was back in his childhood living room. He could see the dust motes dancing in a shaft of afternoon sunlight. He could smell the faint scent of lavender laundry soap that always clung to his mother's clothes. He remembered the feeling of safety he had when she was near, the feeling that no matter how bad things got at school or with friends, she would be there to fix it with a hug and a warm meal. He poured all those memories into the strings. He played the warmth of her hand on his forehead when he had a fever. He played the sound of her singing off-key in the kitchen while she made dinner. He played the pride in her voice when he played his first recital. The song he chose was Simple Gifts, an old Shaker tune. It was a piece of music that everyone knew, but in the hands of a grieving son, it became something entirely new. It was deceptively simple, yet incredibly hard to play perfectly because it required so much control. You couldn't hide behind fast notes or fancy tricks. You had to let every tone ring out clear and true. Leo played it with a slow, dragging tempo, pulling the bow across the strings with such care that it looked like he was afraid the instrument might shatter. The sound spilled out of the room and washed over the people standing in the hallway. For the businessman in the gray suit, the music felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. He had been carrying the burden of being the strong one for his family for weeks, terrified of showing weakness. But hearing the raw honesty in Leo's playing gave him permission to feel. He felt a burning behind his eyes, a tightness in his throat that he couldn't swallow away. He didn't fight it. He let the tears come, wetting his cheeks, not caring who saw him. For David, the nurse, the music was a stark contrast to his daily reality. His world was usually filled with alarms, shouting, rush, and the constant pressure to save lives. This was the opposite. It was slow. It was peaceful. It reminded him that his job wasn't just about biology and medicine. It was about caring for the spirit. He watched Leo's fingers move on the neck of the cello, fascinated by the focus. He realized that in this moment, this boy was doing more for his mother than any medicine ever could. He was providing a bridge, a way for her to let go if she needed to. The janitor, leaning on his mop, had taken off his headphones completely. He usually listened to talk radio or loud rock music to drown out the noise of the hospital, but he didn't need that now. The cello was better. It was real. It made him think of the church he used to go to as a boy, the silence and the reverence. He bowed his head, not in prayer exactly, but in respect. It felt like a holy moment, a sacred thing that was happening in the most ordinary of places. Even Diane, the volunteer coordinator who had tried to stop the music just minutes ago, felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She looked at the clipboard in her hand and felt a sense of shame for how rigid she had been. Rules were important, yes, but compassion was more important. She looked at the back of Leo's head, at the way his shoulders moved with the music, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude that he had ignored her. She was glad he had stood his ground. She was glad he was playing. The music seemed to alter the chemistry of the hospital hallway. The sharp chemical smell of antiseptic felt to fade, replaced by the imagined scent of old wood and rosin. The harsh fluorescent lights felt softer, less intrusive. The frantic energy that usually buzzed through the building was replaced by a calm stillness. People weren't checking their watches. They weren't looking at their phones. They were just there, in the moment, bound together by the music. Inside the room, the connection between the sound and the silence was deepening. The machines were still beeping, the heart monitor tracing its jagged green lines, but it felt like they were keeping time with the cello. The rhythm of the song seemed to sync up with the rhythm of the room. Leo took a deep breath and transitioned into the higher part of the melody. The notes soared, clear and piercing, full of a longing that words could never express. It was the sound of love trying to reach across a divide, trying to touch someone who was drifting away. He wasn't thinking about technique anymore. He wasn't thinking about intonation or vibrato. He was playing purely on instinct. Every pull of the bow was a question. Can you hear me? Are you still there? Do you know I love you? And every release of the bow was a plea. Please don't go. Not yet. Just one more minute. The emotional weight of it was almost too much to bear. The people in the hallway could feel it radiating off the boy. It was a heavy, beautiful thing. It reminded them of their own loves, their own losses, and the fragile thread that connects us all to one another. It was a reminder that life is precious and short, and that music has the power to say the things we are too scared to speak out loud. As the song reached its climax, Leo played with a sudden burst of passion. He leaned into the instrument, his body swaying, his face contorted with the effort of getting the feeling out. The sound swelled, filling the hallway, bouncing off the ceiling, echoing in the stairwells. It was a sound that demanded to be heard, a sound that refused to be ignored. It was a declaration of love in the face of death. Then, just as the intensity peaked, Leo began to ease back. The music started to descend, getting quieter, softer, gentler. He was guiding the song down from the heights of emotion, bringing it back to earth. The transition was seamless, like a bird gliding in for a landing. He slowed the tempo even more, drawing out the final phrases. The silence between the notes grew longer, creating a sense of anticipation, a holding of breath.
The crowd in the hallway leaned in closer, mesmerized. They knew it was coming to an end, and they didn't want it to stop. The music felt like a protective blanket, and as it grew softer, the reality of the hospital, the pain, the sickness, the sadness, threatened to rush back in. But for now, the music still held them in its grip. Diane wiped a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. The man in the gray suit took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The teenage girl near the elevators had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. They were all witnessing something incredibly private, yet it felt like it belonged to all of them. It was a communal experience of grief and love. Leo's fingers on the fingerboard were moving slower now. The vibrations of the strings hummed against his chest. He focused all his energy on the sound, trying to make it perfect, trying to make it reach her. He thought about the last time she smiled at him, a faint, tired smile from the hospital bed a few days ago. He tried to picture that smile, to project it into the music. He wanted her to know that it was okay. He wanted her to know that he would be okay. He was telling her, in the only language he had left, that she could rest now, that she could let go. The room was filled with a profound sense of peace. The anger and the fear that Leo had felt earlier were gone, melted away by the music. There was only love, pure, deep, heartbreaking love. He drew the bow across the strings one last time, starting the long, slow fade that would bring the song to an end. The sound hung in the air, shimmering like a mirage, before beginning its slow descent into silence. Everyone in the hallway held their breath, waiting, watching, feeling the weight of the moment press gently against their hearts. The final note of the song didn't just stop, it seemed to dissolve into the air, hanging there like a breath held for too long, before fading away into absolute silence. Leo kept the bow resting on the strings, his arm frozen in place, afraid that even the slightest movement would shatter the moment. He didn't pull the instrument away immediately. He just sat there, his eyes still closed, listening as the echo of the music died out, leaving the heavy quiet of the hospital room rushing back in to fill the empty space. For a few seconds, nobody moved. In the hallway, the crowd of strangers stood as if they were frozen in time. The businessman had his handkerchief half raised to his face, paused in midair. The janitor held his mop with both hands, his head bowed. David, the nurse, and Diane, the volunteer, stood shoulder to shoulder, neither of them speaking. It was one of those rare moments where the world seems to stop spinning, where a singular shared experience connects everyone together, even if just for a heartbeat. The music had been so powerful, so full of raw emotion, that the silence that followed felt sacred. It felt wrong to clap, and it felt wrong to walk away, so they just stood there, letting the feeling wash over them. Inside the room, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical beep of the heart monitor. It seemed louder now, almost intrusive after the beauty of the cello. Leo slowly opened his eyes. He felt drained, like he had just run a marathon, but there was also a sense of lightness in his chest. He had said what he needed to say. He had poured his heart out, and now, whatever happened next, he knew he had done his best. He took a deep, shaky breath and lowered the bow to his lap. He reached out with his free hand and gently touched his mother's fingers. Her hand was cool to the touch, her skin fragile like parchment. "Goodbye, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the word. "I love you." He expected her to stay still. He expected the silence to continue, broken only by the machines. He was preparing himself to stand up, to pack the cello away, and to face the rest of his life without her. But then, something happened that made his heart skip a beat. There was a soft rustle in the bed. Leo froze, his eyes widening. He stared at his mother, hardly daring to believe it. Her fingers, which had been lying so still on the white sheet, twitched slightly. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but to Leo it was as loud as a thunderclap. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. Then, slowly, very slowly, her head turned. It moved just an inch or two, but it was enough. Her face, which had been pointed toward the blank white wall, turned toward him. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, charged with a sudden electric tension. In the hallway, Diane saw the movement and took a sharp, small breath. David stepped forward a pace, his professional instinct kicking in, checking the monitors to see if the numbers were changing. But the heart monitor kept its steady rhythm, unchanged. The person inside the body was waking up. Her eyelids, which had been closed for days, began to flutter. It was a struggle, like they were heavy, but after a moment, they slowly lifted. Her gaze was unfocused at first, cloudy and distant, looking through the room as if seeing something far away. But then her eyes found him. She looked directly at Leo, her gaze locking onto his face. Time seemed to stand completely still. Leo couldn't speak. He just sat there, his hand still holding hers, looking into the eyes of the woman who had given him everything. He saw a spark of recognition in them, a tiny flicker of light that hadn't been there before. She didn't say anything, she didn't have the strength to speak, but she didn't have to. Her eyes said everything. They were filled with a soft, tired warmth. She knew he was there. She knew he had been playing for her. And then a small miracle happened. The corner of her mouth curved upward. It was just a faint ghost of a smile, barely more than a twitch of her lips, but it was the most beautiful thing Leo had ever seen. It was a smile of pride, a smile of love, a smile that said, "I heard you."
As that smile formed, a single tear formed in the corner of her eye. It grew heavy and slid slowly down her pale cheek, leaving a wet track on her skin. It was a heartbreaking, beautiful sight. It was the only physical sign of the emotion she was feeling, the only response she could give to the beautiful gift her son had given her. The reaction rippled out into the hallway. The people watching couldn't see the smile from where they were standing, but they could see Leo's face. They saw the look of pure, overwhelming love and relief that washed over him. They saw the tears that suddenly sprung from his eyes, unchecked and streaming down his face. They knew something had changed. They knew the music had worked. Diane let out a soft sob, bringing her hand up to cover her mouth. The sound seemed to break the spell for the rest of the crowd. The man in the gray suit finally wiped his eyes, shaking his head in amazement. The janitor stood up straight, wiping his hands on his pants, looking at the scene with a sense of reverence. Even the teenager by the elevator looked visibly moved, wiping her nose on her sleeve. David, the nurse, stepped back into the room, but he didn't interrupt. He just watched the monitors, his own eyes shining. He knew that in the medical charts, this would just be recorded as a moment of brief lucidity before the end. He knew that she wasn't cured, and that she would likely slip away again soon. But in this job, you learned that numbers and charts didn't tell the whole story. They didn't capture the humanity of a moment like this. This wasn't about medicine, it was about peace. The boy had given his mother a moment of clarity and connection in the middle of the fog. He had given her a proper goodbye. Leo squeezed his mother's hand gently, his own tears dripping onto the blanket. "You heard me," he whispered again, a smile breaking through his own tears. "You really heard me." She squeezed his hand back, just the slightest pressure, a feeble but undeniable response. It was her way of saying, "I always hear you." The room was filled with a profound sense of completion. The fear and the anger were gone, replaced by a deep, bittersweet sadness that was bearable because it was mixed with so much love. Leo realized then that this was why he played music. It wasn't for applause or for grades. It was for moments exactly like this. It was to bridge the gap between hearts when words failed. He leaned forward and kissed his mother's forehead gently. Her skin was cool, but her presence was warm. He stayed like that for a long time, just holding her hand, listening to the beep of the machine, feeling the love that surrounded them both from the people standing silently in the hall. They were all witnesses to a private miracle, a moment of grace in a place often filled with pain. Eventually, Leo sat back and carefully wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at the people in the doorway. He saw Diane weeping softly, the nurses with misty eyes, the strangers who had stopped to care. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. He realized that by opening his heart and playing, he had allowed all these people to feel something too. He had shared his burden, and they had helped him carry it. He didn't play another note. He didn't need to. The music had done its work. The silence that followed now wasn't empty or scary. It was peaceful.
It was the quiet of a job well done, of a love fully expressed. Leo gently laid his hand on his mother's arm, watching her breathing slow and steady, content in the knowledge that even if she closed her eyes again, the last thing she saw was him, and the last thing she felt was his music. The hallway began to slowly clear as people drifted away, carrying the memory of that moment with them, leaving the boy and his mother in the quiet, holy peace of the room.